Good morning and welcome to Sunday School. Before I begin today's lesson, I have a question. If I want to know about God, where do I look? In the Bible. The Bible tells me I can look at what God made and I can figure out there is a God. I can figure out he's big and strong, but that is all I can know. If I want to know if God loves me or what sin is or how to get to heaven, I have to look in the Bible. We've been going through the book of Acts, having so many adventures, and we are finally to the last section of Acts, not the last chapter, but the last section. And from this point on, I said last week, this is the last turning point in the book of Acts. And so I'm going to remind us of where we've been before we take the turn into the last few chapters. So we had started out with Jesus's instructions that the people were supposed to tell everybody about Jesus in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And the book of Acts really follows that pattern. We start in Jerusalem for the first several chapters as people tell people in Jerusalem about Jesus. Philip launches a ministry out into Samaria. Others take it into Judea. And then Paul is really one of the main ones who starts really pushing the gospel out into the ends of the earth through 3 missionary journeys. So his first and his second missionary journey and his third, he starts out from what's really become his home church in Antioch, Syria. And at the end of his third missionary journey, he's ready to go back to Antioch, Syria and do what he did the first 2 times, tell everybody about the amazing things that happened on the trip. But something happened. Just as he was about to get on board the ship to sail home, he finds out there are people on that ship who are planning to kill him. So he does not get on the ship. He instead turns around and takes the land route all the way back up through Greece and crosses over into Turkey. And sometime in this journey, he's listening to God, and God tells him, you know what, Antioch, Syria is not where you're supposed to go. You actually need to go to Jerusalem. And so he changes course. And he decides, I really want to get to Jerusalem in time for Pentecost. Pentecost was one of 3 festivals a year where all the Jews were supposed to go to Jerusalem. And so instead of continuing by foot through all of Turkey, he decides this trip's got to get a little faster because Pentecost is on a specific date. And if I'm going to get to Jerusalem by then, we got to get moving. So he and his traveling companions get on a boat and sail along the coast of Turkey. But sailing in those days was not like sailing today. You didn't just get on one boat, sail to your destination, and get off, okay? You made multiple stops. You had to get water, food, trade goods, exchange passengers. It's almost like riding a train today, lots of stops. And so as he's stopping along this journey, another thing happens. God begins to warn Paul that although he does need to go to Jerusalem, and that's where he should be, that something is going to happen in Jerusalem and it's not going to be easy. And so he begins by warning the Ephesian elders, I don't think I'm going to see you again. Something's going to happen in Jerusalem, but this is where God told me to go. Then as they keep going, not only is Paul getting this message, but God's giving the message to the church. And so as he stops at church after church along the way, they're saying, hey, God is warning us something's going to happen in Jerusalem. They think that Paul shouldn't go. They didn't understand the message. The message was not that Paul shouldn't go. The message was Paul's going to go, but when something happens that doesn't look good, that they needed to not panic because this was God's plan for Paul. So Paul has finally arrived with his traveling companions at Jerusalem when we left off last week, and he barely made it in time. So it is 50 days from Passover to Pentecost. And if you do the math and add up the travel itinerary from when it tells us it's Passover to when Pentecost happens, he made it to Jerusalem at best 2 or 3 days before Pentecost starts. So he is pulled into town right in time. And again, Jerusalem is packed with people. This is the one of 3 times a year all the Jews are supposed to come to Jerusalem. It's so packed, he and his companions aren't even staying in Jerusalem. It told us in the last verse we read that they were staying in the home of Mason, one of the first converts from Cyprus. So they are at Jerusalem, they're near Jerusalem, staying nearby with Mason, and they're making daily trips into town to observe Pentecost. And that is where we start today in verse Acts chapter 21, verse 17. So let's find out what happens. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly, and the next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard this, they praised God. And they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. But they've been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses and tell them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so they can have their heads shaved. And then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we've written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." And so the next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul in the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help us." This man is one who teaches all men everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused, and people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they drug him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. And when the rioters saw the commanders and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him bound with 2 chains. Then he asked someone who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed shouted, "Away with him!" And that is where we are going to stop. So, this is not going well for Paul, right? So let's go back through today's section and make sure that we understand it, because there are some Old Testament things here that aren't explained here. And so I want to make sure you understand them. So when Paul arrives in Jerusalem, he immediately gets together with the elders of the Jerusalem church, including James, the brother of Jesus, and all the other elders, and does what he wanted to do in Antioch, Syria. He tells them all the amazing things that God has done on his journeys and all the people that have decided to follow Jesus as Messiah. And the leaders are thrilled. They are so excited and encouraged to hear what God's done. But they know that there's also going to be a problem. So up to this point, the church has been made up of two groups of people who were raised Jewish and have believed that Jesus is the Messiah, and people who were raised Gentile and believe Jesus is the Messiah. And these two groups have always lived in some tension. It's been a long time since the gospel's gone to the Gentiles. And so already this issue had been addressed once, and the elders of the church of Jerusalem had written a letter and sent it to all the Gentile churches saying, you do not have to obey the entire law of Moses to be saved, because you don't. You have to trust Jesus to be saved. But they did put out 4 things that they expected the Gentile believers to do so that Jews and Gentiles could be together fellowshipping and following Jesus. And those things were, they needed to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. And it wasn't just to promote fellowship, it was also to keep the Gentiles safe, because all of these things would have got them turning back to worshiping idols instead of following Jesus Messiah. So this was also a protection for the Gentile believers. So when Paul gets to Jerusalem and meets with the elders, their concern is not for the Gentile believers. Their concern is about the Jewish believers and the Jews who live in this area and are here for Pentecost, okay? Because they've been hearing about Paul's ministry among the Gentiles, and they are not happy about what they've heard. They've heard that Paul is speaking against Moses and against the law of Moses. Now, is that true? From what we have seen in Acts, is it true that Paul is speaking against Moses? No. Is he speaking against the law of Moses? No. But that's what people have heard. And so 4 men have made a vow that know what Paul is teaching probably and say, we know there's no truth in this and we're going to prove it. When Paul comes, we are going to fulfill this vow so that everybody knows that Paul has not been teaching against Moses or against the law of Moses. And so this is where this Old Testament knowledge comes in handy. So when people made a vow, they had to go to the priest at the temple and tell him, I'm making this vow. They had to tell him what the vow was. They had to set a date for the end of the vow, and they had to agree on what sacrifices would be offered to fulfill the vow. And so Paul is told, hey, to prove that this is a complete lie, you need to take these 4 men, join them in their purification rites and pay their expenses, and then have your head shaved. So Paul agrees to obey the church elders in Jerusalem. He takes the 4 men to the temple, they meet with the priest, they set a time, and Paul's ready to establish that there's no truth to this rumor. But before he even gets it done, before the 7 days are over, because it's only 7 days from the date you meet with the priest till the end of your purification, before he even gets to the 7 days, there's trouble in the temple. Now remember, it's Pentecost. So every day Paul's going to the temple to celebrate Pentecost. And one day before we get to the 7, he's there. A group of Jews from Asia recognize him. Because remember, Asia is modern day Turkey. This is a place he had ministered on all 3 of his missionary trips. So they know who Paul is. They see him in the temple and they go berserk. they start shouting and everybody comes running, and they accuse him of teaching against Moses, teaching against the law. But they add one more thing, and this is what gets the mob started. They accuse him of bringing a Greek into the temple. Now, this was a huge deal. There was actually a stone carved sign outside the temple area that said no Greeks allowed. And if you brought a Gentile or a Greek into this area, that person would be killed. Okay. This is a death penalty sin. So they are making a huge accusation against Paul. But what's interesting is if Paul has brought a Greek into the temple, where's the Greek? Why didn't they take care of it while they were in there, right? If there's a Greek in the temple, you should have taken care of the Greek, right? He's the one disobeying the law. But there's no Greek with Paul in the temple. And we know from the text, Paul had not brought a Greek in. They're just accusing him and getting a riot started. So sure enough, everybody's so upset that there might have been a Greek in the temple courts that they immediately grab Paul and drag him out of the temple, and the temple gates are shut because you don't want to murder people in the temple courts because that's like their holy place. So they're okay to murder outside of the temple, just not inside. I hope you see the hypocrisy in that. But anyway, they drag him out, shut the gates, and the mob is ready trying to kill Paul. There's only one problem. So overlooking the temple is the fortress of Antonius, which is the Roman barracks. And so there's a whole huge amount of Roman soldiers overlooking this area. And they hear the city's in an uproar, look down from the fortress and see there's a mob and somebody's getting beat. And so soldiers come streaming down to stop this. And so in no time at all, I did not have enough flannel soldiers to do this justice. Okay, you need to picture hundreds of Roman soldiers pouring out of the building right next to the temple to stop this. So everybody stops. Riot is immediately over at the sight of Roman soldiers. They come to Paul. They assume he's got to have done something really bad. So they arrest him and are ready to drag him off into the fortress, which is right next to the temple, and deal Roman justice on whatever has gone wrong. But they're not going to let the mob deliver justice, okay? And that's where today's lesson ends, but it's going to set us up for next week's lesson because Paul is going to speak to the crowd. And so from today's lesson, there are two main applications. The first is, again, this is scary. He's in the temple, he's getting mobbed, he's getting beat. But remember, this is God's plan for Paul. God had told Paul ahead of time, he had warned the churches ahead of time. And so remember, we're not supposed to panic. God is going to use this for Paul and for the growth of the church. So that's number one. And then the second one is, I want you to see this week, Paul bravely told the believers in Jerusalem the good news about what God had done. And the people were excited to hear. But next week, Paul's also going to share the good news of what God has done. And it's going to be with a crowd that is not wanting to hear it. And the application is we need to be brave because Paul was willing to share Jesus, whether the people wanted to hear or don't want to hear. And we want to be faithful like that. We want to make sure that we tell people about Jesus when they are interested, but that we don't turn silent when we think they aren't or when they're angry. We need to tell them about Jesus no matter what their response is, because that's what Jesus asked us to do. So keep that in your mind as we launch next week into what Paul has to say to the angry mob. So I'm looking forward to answering any questions you have from this lesson. Again, the plot is thickening. There's a lot of tension in this lesson, but I'm happy to answer as many questions as you have. And I look forward to being with you next week as we hear Paul deliver a message to the crowd. Thanks for listening.